So I'm sure most of you have used context in React, and the number one use case that you often hear is so that you can avoid prop drilling. So if you have a parent that has multiple children and you need to share some state amongst all those, you can use context to kind of take dispatch functions and kind of share them amongst all these children components. But I think something that's a little bit more useful when it comes to context is the idea that you can use it for dependency injection. Okay, so what is a dependency injection? Basically, let's say that you have an API. Let's say you want to create some type of API. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say api.ts. So inside this API file, I'm going to say export class, and I'll say data muse API. And that's just going to have a constructor here. And then inside of that constructor, you could have some methods, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say like get words sounding like, and then we'll pass in some word like this. And basically what I'm going to do is I have this data muse API over here, which is I think a free to use API. And I'm going to go ahead and just invoke this with fetch. Now, first of all, wrapping and abstracting away your API calls with some type of class or function is pretty useful because now you don't have to worry about having your hard-coded URLs all in your code base. So let's just go ahead and say return fetch. We're going to go ahead and pass in an interpolated string here. And instead of hard-coding dog, I'm going to pass in word. Okay. And then we're going to say .then. I'll say response.json. Cool. So we have a nice little method that we can call. And then inside of our page, we could basically have a button or, fire an effect that basically calls this API to get some data, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say button and then on click. Actually, over here, what I'm going to do is instead of exporting the class, I'm just going to go ahead and say export const data muse API equals new data muse API. Why did I use a class in this example? I really don't know, but find the way to work past my use of a class keyword in this example and just kind of understand what I'm trying to teach here. Okay, so what we could do is when you click on this thing, I'm going to go ahead and just import data muse API, and I'm going to say dot get words sounding like dog. Okay, we can go ahead and just say like async here. We could say const words is equal to await that. And then, of course, we could probably have some type of state. And I'm just going to keep this simple. We're just going to go ahead and just console log this out. Like, we're not going to add in state or try to render anything. Let's go back to our UI here. Where's my button? My button's gone. Oh, I didn't add any text, so I'll say click me. There we go. We got a nice button. Let's go ahead and click it. And now notice that we get back a response. So pretty straightforward. It's a button that calls an instantiated object using a class, and it makes a request to get words that sound like dog. So we have dog, we have Doug. I don't know if most of these even sound like dog, but so you get the point. But what exactly does any of this have to do with context? Well, I think dependency injection is this term that's really important when it comes to testing because it makes decoupling your components a lot easier. And imagine if you had this API that's imported, I don't know, in 20 or 30 different components, right? Overall, it's not an issue, but if for whatever reason you decide that you don't want to use an API, you want to use like a local running mock service, you basically, in all your test cases, you'd have to like find a way to mock out this import, right? Because all this stuff is just depending on this API function. I mean, there's other ways to do it too. And of course, there's other ways to do it. So let's take a step back and we're going to go ahead and add a layout here like this. And again, I'm using Next.js, but it should be fine. So inside the layout, let's go ahead and create a context, right? The idea is I want to create context that actually holds this instantiated data muse API object instead of every single file having to import this thing and use that cache ES6 module, right? So we're going to go up here. I'm going to say export. I'll say data muse context, maybe API context. And I can just go ahead and say const is equal to create context. Now, the cool thing about context is you can actually make an interface. I can just go ahead and say data muse API provider, and this is going to take in some type of interface. So in our case, we want the interface to look like this. I'm going to go ahead and say get words sounding like. I'm taking a word, and it's going to return a string. And so I'm going to type this with that interface here. I guess you can call it a type. I'll go ahead and just allow this to be null, and I'll just pass a default null here, okay? So now that we have the data muse API context, instead of having a div here, we could just go ahead and set a provider here. And then when you use a provider, you can provide a value. So like, what is the default value? And it turns out it needs to match this interface. Well, we could just go ahead and import that instantiated data muse API. Just go ahead and do this right here. Now, I will say our API is a little bit incorrect. If we want to make this more proper, we're going to go ahead and go back, and I'm going to make this a promise that returns an object that has word, which will be a string like this. And that'll be an array of things. So we're defining the interface so that anywhere else in our application, or if you're making like a third-party library, they can import this interface and start using it in their application, and they're not going to be very tightly coupled to the underlying implementation, right? So what do I mean by tightly coupled? Well, right now I'm passing in an instantiated class, okay, an instance of a class. But instead, if I just wanted to do like functional programming or just pass in an object, I just need to make sure that I match this interface, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just make a function here, and that can return whatever I want it to return, right? It just needs to match an array, and then we're going to go ahead and just say word of hello. And then probably put async here because the interface does require to have a promise returned. So hopefully you get the idea that as long as you match that interface that you defined up here, you can pass whatever you want to this. It just has to have the right methods to it. And I'll talk about this later in just a bit because it's really useful in terms of testing and like mocking and stubbing out your dependencies. But let's just go ahead and add that in. And then if we go back to the children that are using this, instead of this being tightly coupled to that API, right? What we could do instead is we're going to go ahead and say const datamuse API is equal to use context. And then we're going to go ahead and pass in that context that is right here. Okay, go ahead and pass that in. So this is potentially undefined. So what you probably want to do is like, just don't render until it gets defined. Or you could just do a question mark here and only call this if it is defined. I think it'd be better to say like if datamuse API is not defined, then just like return a null or something, okay? Just so that TypeScript error goes away. Okay, so it's the exact same code. If I were to go to the UI and run this, go ahead and click this. Notice that it does do the exact same thing. It makes a request, passes in dog as an argument, and we get back all the words that sound like dog. And just to show you a little trick, I've seen a lot of libraries basically, instead of having to depend on use context, you might actually have a method called like use data, use API context, like that. And then you don't need to pass in the context here. So let's just go ahead and just refactor this code just a little bit so I teach you guys a different approach to do this. We're going to go ahead and say export const use datamuse API context. That's going to be a function. Actually, I could just do this. And this is going to return the use context of the datamuse API context. Import that. And so what this allows you to do is we can just import that thing, and it kind of abstracts us away from like needing to know about the context and all this stuff. It's just a nice like abstraction away from all that. So now I want to hit on my final point, which is the decoupling, right? The dependency injection that we just kind of acquired by doing the providers in the context. If you have a test, now I'm going to pseudocode this. If I have like a test that wants to verify my page, so I'll say like page test.tsx or something. Again, this is pseudocode, but typically if you're using like React testing library or some other type of library, no one uses enzyme anymore. But if you wanted to test your page, what you want to do is you want to import your page. So I'll just say like import other page from page. And then let's say I wanted to render out this page. Okay, so I just go like this and render it out. But now in your test, you can easily mock this thing out simply by just adding your own provider, right? So all I need to do is I need to make sure I have some type of mock provider set up here like this. Go ahead and import that. And now I can provide whatever I want inside of this object. So if this is my test, I can just literally do this. I can just return absolutely nothing if I want to. Put an async in front of there. So this is really powerful when it comes to unit testing because now we can load in this other page in any of the normal dependencies I was going to try to use and run, such as making API requests when you click buttons. Instead, you can modify and change the behavior due to how this provider in the context kind of works. Yeah, that's all I kind of wanted to share with you all in this video. I think it's a good topic to kind of talk about and make sure you understand. And you've probably seen this before, and hopefully you have if you write unit tests and you ever had to like mock stuff out. But that's kind of how it all works, and that's kind of why we use providers, because it just gives you a way to decouple your components from like implementation details, and it allows you to swap out functionality because you have an interface, and it makes the code a lot cleaner in certain situations where you think you might need to swap stuff out. All right, that's all I got. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. Give me a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, and like always, I have a Discord channel. You guys are welcome to join if you want to find a place to kind of hang out and talk to other developers. Other than that, have a good day and happy coding.